You might have to take my word for it, but seriously, a mustard seed is so small you can't even see it when I pick it up. And that's what our parable is about today. So we're continuing in our study of parables. This one is a little different. This one's very short. It's 2 verses. And so we're not going to be really heavy on Scripture today, but we are going to be real heavy on Holy Spirit and maybe some vision. I believe our church is ready for something different, something new. We got to figure out what that is. And so we have to dig into some of these parables, learn what it is that Jesus was asking for the early church. You know, when Jesus was preaching these parables, there wasn't a church, so to speak, not as we know it today, anyways. Their church was gathering out in the fields, the pasture next to the Sea of Galilee, wherever they happen to be. That was the church. We get so stuck on this building with 4 walls and a roof and maybe some heat or some air conditioning if it's summertime. But that's not the church. That is just the building. And that's what we have to get our minds wrapped around. So I called today, on the screen I put the mustard seed, but I called it Faith and the Church. And there's a little bit more to this mustard seed story besides what's just in these couple of verses that I'm going to read. And I'm going to go back to that verse that I read earlier in the message as well. So I believe we are a mustard seed church. What do I mean by that? Well, we are seeing mustard seed before. Afterward, come up and see a few. Now Carrie's got to figure out how we're going to use the rest of these mustard seeds. I don't know what she's going to do. Just don't want them to go to waste. We're not going to use the ones that are on the table. We'll just throw those away. What?
Nobody knows the difference.
Here in the U.S., but maybe a 1/4 inch wide or something like that. They're small, not very big. We are small, like I said, but we can multiply into something extraordinary. The problem is, and maybe this isn't a problem, but usually we have to be willing to change. And sometimes we're stagnant. We don't want to change anything. We like to keep doing what's comfortable. Well, Jesus actually didn't do anything that was comfortable. If you follow anything that he did, I'm just wanting to open up our eyes, see what it is that God wants us to do in our church. So let's dig into that before I get any further and forget to do this. We're going to read 3 verses from Matthew chapter 3. We did the parable of soils a couple weeks before that. But this one is about the mustard seed, and also another verse is about yeast, and we'll get to that as well. But he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all the seeds, that when it grows, it is the largest garden plant and trees. It's kind of a bush. Not only was there a little bit more to it, but he also took some time to explain. He doesn't take the time to explain it, or at least Matthew doesn't include anything that shows that he explained. It's not in his book. Multiplied by 10, 100, 1,000. Kind of stretching what you're saying, exactly. But he used it to emphasize his point. So the definition of a hyperbole is exaggerated statements or claims that are not meant to be taken literally. A college campus initially. Well, now it's a church. She calls it Spark. You might have heard of that if you've been to district assembly or something. She's shared about it before. But she took an idea, just an idea that she had in her head, and created a new ministry out of it. Many churches actually go through this cycle. We don't like to always call ourselves a church plant because we've been around for 100+ years. And we celebrated our 100th anniversary just a few years ago. So the group, the gathering is not new, But every church was a church plant at some point. So this one started as a revival meeting. It was in a tent. In fact, this building, the property, hosted a tent revival in the early days as well. The church was already formed, but if you go back and look at our history, and we brought this up when we did especially our 90th, we spent a lot of time when we did that one. We talked a lot about how this place eventually became a church. So we are a church plant. Many, many churches have gone through this replanting process. And all that really means is that you're revisioning, you're reimagining what the church is. The leader, or our host of that week, was Pastor Scott Powell of the Pratt Church, the Abundant Harvest Church. When he went to that church, it was in shambles. It was really struggling. They had, I think, about 13 people. Take that, look around the room. Mm-hmm. And now that church is regularly closer to 100. And this is a church in a town smaller than what we are. Pratt is not a very big town. And they have done some amazing things there. Just changing the minds, changing how you look at what church is. That doesn't mean you have to be radical. It's just making some adjustments, looking around and seeing what's happening here, and maybe what's not happening here as well. This is exactly what Jesus' ministry did. So he began as an itinerant pastor. You know, we've heard about that. If you have done any research studying of Pastor John Wesley, you know, kind of one of our, not directly a church founding member, but he is kind of one of our fathers that we look at. He was an itinerant pastor. So he rode on horseback from church to church. Most of the churches in those early days, back in the 18th century, they didn't have regular pastors. They couldn't support a pastor. They were just a group of people that gathered in some meeting place, and he built them up. He used what we've done a little bit here, something called small groups. Now, he called it something different, but that's what they were doing. He would bring a small group of people together, and they would have these discussions about their faith, where they were personally at, where their church was at. Not so different from the churches that we read about that the letters that Paul wrote. It's very similar, but this was the early church. It was the Methodist church, really is what came out of that, in the early days of America, back in the 1700s. So every church was a church plant at that time. But this is what Jesus was doing too, back before there was a church. He was going, and of course the synagogues were present then, but I'm talking about early Christianity. He was just going from place to place and preaching. Now, they didn't call them pastors back then either. He was a rabbi for them. So he began, again, as an itinerant mission with just 12. So I used the number 13, but use number 12. How many people are in this room? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in this room. Now we have some people down the hall, so we're a little bit higher than 12. But what I'm using this as an example because we're not much different than what was happening back then. And I would argue that, I said 10, I didn't count myself. The 11 of us in this room are all disciples. That's what we're called to be. But the thing is with the early church that Jesus was starting is it grew a lot. If you remember, we're not that far from Pentecost. It's June usually, somewhere in there. But remember what happened in the Pentecost. And I shared this verse last week as well. Acts 1:8. He tells us Paul was talking, it was Jesus talking at this time. He's talking about going in our community, in our church, in our community, our region, and to the ends of the earth. And we're all called to do that. Every church is called to do that. We also follow something that we refer to as the Great Commission in Matthew 28. I also shared that last week. But our present failure to recognize Jesus' authority masks the greater reality that is yet to be made known. So, if we just keep sitting on our hands, keep doing the things that we've always done, nothing's going to change. Absolutely nothing will change. And most of this comes down to faith. And that's why I share Matthew 17:20. Because you have so little faith, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as this little bitty mustard seed, remember, you can't even see it in my hand, this little bitty guy, if you have that much faith, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, because nothing is impossible for you if you have that level of faith. Now, he's not actually, again, this is hyperbole, he's not actually asking you to say to that mountain to move. That's not really what he's asking you to do. He's asking you to have faith to do the impossible. So, this church has been a large church before. When this church first opened, every seat in here would have been full. In fact, there would have been more seating in here than what's in here today. And they were full. In fact, when I first started coming here back in 2008, this church was pretty full. So it can be done again. There's really no reason it can't, because we just have to have that faith that's that small in order for God to do something. So if we're not growing, maybe we don't even have that much faith. I want to challenge you with that today, to think about your level of faith, what that means for you. So another parable that Jesus told and that I read earlier is the parable of the yeast. So it goes along really well with what we just read about the mustard seed parable. Yeast permeates throughout the dough as you knead it. And I'm not a baker or anything, so I didn't bring dough today, but so like this yeast, the kingdom will not only dramatically and miraculously grow into a large tree, but it will also affect everything around it. If you remember when we did our 90th celebration, we had trees on this wall over here, and we put different things on it. But so, in fact, we even had a Sunday school class at one point that we called Roots. That was an adult Sunday school class, kind of built off of that same idea. In fact, I think it started kind of around that time period. So think of yourselves as a tree that's branching out outside of these walls into our city and beyond. Ooh, really big tree. Think of a really big tree. We have a few around town that are really massive. But let's back to this yeast. So the yeast could be thought of as something that's hidden. I mean, when you put yeast into dough, if you're still bake bread that way, you don't know the yeast is there, because that's not the point. It's the result of the yeast being kneaded into the bread, into the dough, that makes it rise. That's actually what you want. The hidden truths of the kingdom contained in these parables are those things that concern its mysterious and miraculous growth. These two parables speak of this miraculous growth in the early church. The hope of the church conquering other nations is probably a bit too much. We're not, again, he's not asking us to physically go to war. He's asking us to fight his battle of the kingdom, of his kingdom. So instead we might focus on the positive role the church can play in society without seeking to control those political fames and social spheres. Instead, focusing to seek to restore and deliver to the lost. So in my ministry classes, one of the classes I took early on, way back in October 2019, was called Declaring the Gospel of God. Now, it is primarily about evangelism. That was one of the things. But we merged it with another class provided by DCPI, which is Dynamic Church Planting International. And it was called Church Planting Essentials. So one of the things that we had to do in that class is we had to ask some serious questions. And one of the things that we asked was, why would anybody want to plant a church? We noted such things as reaching the unchurched, honoring God, spreading his fame throughout the nations, and more specifically, we listed our reasons. Why do we want to do that? Multiplication, not addition, multiplication. There's been all sorts of different things. If you've been in the church long enough, you've seen reach one, teach one. I can't think of any others right now, but there's been all sorts of different things that we've tried as a church to really nail home. It's not about, oh, I invited somebody, I'm done. No. You invite somebody, and then you invite somebody else, and they invite somebody, and they invite somebody else. But again, that's just the numbers part. That's not really what we're talking about here. Some of the other reasons that we're talking about are filling in gaps in churches. Maybe there was a ministry that was missing or lacking in the church. The key is you always got to follow a biblical strategy to do what you're doing. You might want to reach certain people groups. You might want to evangelize more effectively. You gather the harvest. You know, we hear all these different phrases. We fulfill the Great Commission. So after we went through these and defined what they wanted, we took some time and we wrote down the necessary steps. Well, the first step is the most important step. If you don't do it, you might as well close the door. And that's pray. So if you're thinking about such anything's going through your head, I hope it is, about what you think this church could be, don't even talk about it yet until you've prayed about it. That's the most important step. Once you've done that, then you can go to the next step, and that is to plan. This is not something that should be entered into lightly. You have to prepare for whatever it is you're going to do. We don't just willy-nilly want to walk out the door right now and go door to door. I guess you can. But it's good if you have a plan for what you're doing. At the end of this course, we were assigned a vision, plan, timeline, or a VPT. That was my big assignment that I had to do in order to pass that class. So we were told to prepare a preliminary church planting plan that included a list of items. So we had to have a vision statement. The church planting model that we wanted to use. So we talked about some church planting models in there. I'm not getting into that this morning. Your target group. And we were told to be specific. So not just, I want to reach the lost. That's not specific enough. Who do you want to reach? Why do you want to reach them? Is there actually this group that you want to reach? Do they actually exist? We have to actually think about what that means. And you have to pick it. You have to think about your church identity. Now, sometimes that we like to push that aside, but it is important to have some sort of an identity where that's where the vision comes from. You have to think about your discipleship process. So it's not just about getting people into the doors. It's about teaching them, discipling them, helping them become disciples. So you have to think about how you're going to do that. You have to think about your staff support. Now, I'm not asking you to focus on staff support. You have that. But this is something in the church plant that you have to think about. You have to think about your evangelism strategy. So yes, I talked about discipleship. And discipleship it's like the second part of it. You got to do the first part. You got to get people to actually be interested in becoming a believer, into becoming a relationship with Jesus. You have to think about how much this is going to cost too. And you have to have a long-term plan for reproduction. So if our district has kind of done the church planting cycles over the past 10 years or so, it's not as big of an emphasis at the moment. It's still there, but it's not as large of an emphasis as it was there for a little bit. But the idea is a church plant, as soon as a church is planted, you know what they're supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be considering planting a church from the beginning. And we can get stuck on that terminology, and sometimes we get stuck on it a little too much, and that's probably why the district's backed off of it a little bit. But the whole idea is reproduction. You don't want to just be focused not just on the people that gather here. You want to be focused on communities that maybe don't have a church like ours. We look at some of our area small towns. They have churches, but they're struggling just like we are. I'm not just talking about 2019. So that was the beginning of my ministry. This is one of the early classes that I took. And so things looked a little different in this church at that time. We were a pretty thriving church. I think we were growing. Pastor Luke Wise was here at that time. As I was reviewing it in preparation for this message, this is delayed because I intended to preach this message to you last week, but actually not really, because I was not supposed to preach a couple weeks ago. And so this was actually the week I was supposed to preach anyway. So it's, God works in strange ways sometimes. But this February 1st meeting was really what I was doing. When I first started studying this, and I was doing it while I was on that retreat, I was just going through another parable. I wasn't thinking about where God was going to lead me with this. It was only about 3 verses. I was thinking about, man, how am I going to make this into a message? I had no idea. And so I thought about it, I prayed about it. And this is what came out of it. It was not what I expected. But I want to share a little bit about this plan. So again, this plan is not from this past couple of weeks. This plan is from years ago, but it fits so well with where I want us to go. So this is not a concrete plan. I put the message up there and I'm afraid of that. But it is something that I was praying about, that I was thinking about. It needs work. We can't do this on our own. So I need leaders in this church to help me with this. And if you're on my church board, we're going to talk about it next week when we have our meeting. But I wanted to present it to everybody here. I'm also considering bringing in a coach that can help us through this process. So that leader that I talked about, Pastor Scott Powell, actually does this sort of thing. So we'll be talking to him, seeing what he can do. But he has something real small that he can do that's not expensive or anything like that. So one of the things that I wanted to think about was how anything we do here, and we have the close public volunteers. So we already have resources in place. We just got to figure out how to use them. And so this was the plan that I put together, and I actually had to present it. Relatively small print. I said this new church should be small group and discipleship focused. So it's something that we would really, really focus on. It's like the core thing that we would be doing. Outreach and evangelism would be at our core as well. And so then I thought, who would be our target group? Now, again, this is what I came up with at that time. It's not even necessarily what I think right now. But at that time, I chose a target group of young families with children, mixing together with who we already had attending at the time. So that was what I was focused on at that time. So then I talked about my process of discipleship. And so as part of my ministry classes, I learned about different things. I even had a little class for a bit that I taught, like 1920, somewhere in there. Not 1920. 2019 and 2020, that time frame. And this particular class had a graduating approach. So you went through a stage, like a ladder sort of thing. And what the question was that we would be asking is, where is everyone in their faith journey? So we have new believers. And one of the things, and the thing that I did was basic Bible studies for new believers. It's actually this little packet thing that I think it was Chip Shaver, if you're familiar with that name at all, put together, and you just go through the very basics of what it means to be a believer. And then there's more of a spiritual maturity, or what I term the membership class. So if you've taken a membership class from me, and there's a few of you in here that have, kind of go through that, and as a result of that, you would become a member of the church. So it would be a small part of it, but it would be the end result. Then there's exploring spiritual gifts. So you've gone through, you understand what it means to be a believer, you understand what it means to be a member of the Church of Nazarene. You've already gone through that. And so now it's time to really dig into discipleship. And that's talking about exploring your spiritual gifts. So whatever that might be. So identifying what those are, moving forward with those, and then using them. And then finally, it was ministry, outreach, and Bible study. So, not to say you're not somewhere doing all four of these at some point, but the idea was kind of work your way up. A new believer would work his way up all the way until they are contributing discipleship, or disciple for the kingdom. So after we did the processes of discipleship, we talked about the plan. What is the plan? How do we make it sustainable? How's it going to continue? Well, that's multiplication. And so that sort of thing has to be integrated into every facet of the church. All church members would be challenged to personal evangelism, which that shouldn't be anything wild. Again, the Great Commission, that's exactly what that is. That is personal evangelism and outreach. So sometimes you need that outreach to help build on that personal evangelism, to help it become an option for you. Because some of us just aren't great at going up to people and saying, do you know Jesus? It's not me. It's not a gift of mine. Some of you have that. And I would encourage you, if you have that gift, yes, keep doing that. But that's not all that personal evangelism is. Sometimes that is just hearing people, listening to them, sharing your testimony with them. That can turn into something more. And then having regular church-wide events. It's not about entertaining people. You have to do a little bit of that, but it's not really just that. It's about doing things that make people understand what it is that we're trying to do. And then, of course, small group and outreach efforts, which includes that discipleship. So then I came up with a timeline. And again, this is not a timeline for this church. Don't worry about that. This was just the vision for this. But what I was doing was kind of focusing on sort of different phases. And so, again, that Acts 1:8 mentality, where you're starting small and you're growing outward. Well, we also refer to something in our plan. I have the curriculum still. It refers to going to Macedonia, Ephesus, Jerusalem, and Antioch. So, Paul's journeys. So, Macedonia was God to you. Oh, what was the wrong slide? I didn't make that one bigger, so you probably can't read that. But the idea was starting about this time of year. So, kind of winter into spring. And in that period, and this is what I'm going to try to follow with our leadership, this is the time when you pray. Pray for a vision. Write it down. You know, what is a plan if you don't know what it is? You got to write it down. Create this discipleship plan. Recruit some sort of a launch team. How are you going to actually make this happen? Which is probably the board. And then think about doing things like a prayer walk through our community. And of course, it's got to be a little bit warmer than it is even today to really get into that. Maybe it means driving through your community. So how many of our neighbors, even in Courtney down the street, we know Milton across the street, that's about it. We don't know very many more people than that in this neighborhood. So it's something to think about, which means being in the community. It doesn't have to just be within 3 blocks. That's a ministry on its own. Now, it's just a thing. It's just an event we do if we stop there. And that's something I was talking to Eddie a couple weeks ago. It's just him and I in Sunday school. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Yeah. And we were talking about what that might mean. He suggested taking names, learning the people that come in, learning about their lives. It's not about the Bible, so to speak. It's about getting to know them, finding out what they need, and being the church. And so that's something that I think is pretty easy for us to do. Just talking to people, learning about them. And that's that is a built-in outreach for us right now. We don't even all understand what the possibilities are there. But it can grow, and I've seen many other churches do something very similar. You could almost have 2 churches in one if we put it right. And then something called preview services, which I'm not going to get into. So the next phase would be going to Ephesus. So this is about putting something into action. Recruiting leaders. Make sure that we have everybody figuring out what it is we want to do if we're having small groups. Making sure we have all the leaders in the right place. So that might mean somebody that's leading the children, somebody that's leading the youth, somebody that's leading the new believers, and then somebody that's just really focused on discipleship. We have these. We actually have most of these people already in place. We have a Nazarene Discipleship International president. That's Joe, in case you don't know. We have an NYR president, Nazarene Youth International. That's my mom. We have a missions president. Right now, that's Valley. And so we have most of these things already in place. We just got to use them more effectively. And what that can look like. And it's not just that person that's just, right now, that is mostly just a person that holds a title. Not to diminish what anybody's doing. But that's what that is. It's just somebody that's holding that place, somebody that can start something. And so making sure that everybody's in place, that's still part of the deal. And developing a launch plan. So I have always dreamt of not having to be your worship leader. Because let me tell you, it's like doing 2 jobs in one every week. So I'm preparing the message, thinking about what it is I want to talk about, but I'm also preparing what the worship service looks like every single week. I'm not saying that it's too much work or anything like that, but I think I would be more effective in leading this part of the service if I didn't have folks in that. Now, I still want to sing. I enjoy that. I just don't enjoy as much about putting it together and having to focus on that each week. So it's something to think about. We don't have somebody that I'm aware of right now that can do that. So that means we have to get somebody. So the next phase is Jerusalem. And that's the training. That's bringing up these leaders. That's maybe bringing some people that aren't even here yet to do stuff like worship, to focus on hospitality, to focus on that outreach. That's that next phase. So finally, we go to Antioch. And that's when we really put everything into motion. So up to this time, nothing's really changed in what we're doing. But at this point, this is when it changes. Whatever that looks like. So this is when we celebrate the leaders that have brought us to this point. We thank them so much for doing everything, all the hard work they've done. We keep in constant contact with not just the leaders, but everybody that's been kind of with us up to that point. We develop a worship style, whatever that might look like. It might not be different. But we think about that. We get those small groups really going. We develop new leaders. You notice that keeps coming up. That's part of discipleship, is raising up new leaders. So that means everybody in this room, maybe one person not able to do that, yes. But everybody else in this room is capable of being a leader. And then some sort of church-wide outreach event. And in this, I kind of went away from my calendar, but this would be towards the end, like the fourth quarter of the year, if you will. Having some big celebration. And lastly, but important still, and I know you can't read that, that's not really the point. But we had to develop a budget. So this is part of planning. Anything that you do costs money. A lot of this stuff is already focused on. So I went through, I'm going to have to re-update these numbers because they're probably not big enough. At this time, it was a relatively modest budget that we're, if you're not familiar with our finances, we're not able to hit this. What's in here? Right there, it was $58,000. That's about $1,000 a week. So if you're involved with counting, you know that we're not getting a house out of it. And that's probably more than this group of people can do. It's not outrageous. It's not outlandish. That's what this really takes for our church to be. And so I don't really want to read the numbers on this slide because they're irrelevant. Again, they're probably out of date anyways. But I want to tell you what is on there in case you can't read it. Talking about stuff like utilities, insurance, paying your pastor, paying pastor's expenses, payroll taxes, that sort of thing. Facilities. We have to do things to keep this place up. So we have a facility. We don't have to worry about that part. It's already here. Then we need to focus on our different ministries. So the children have to have some sort of funding. The small groups have to have something. Usually that means curriculum. And you know, it varies what that might mean. But there's some expenses related to that. Especially if you're trying to do something beyond just the actual ministry, if you're trying to do an outreach with that group, if you're just eating. I mean, yes, early on, you can just provide it yourselves, but it might be helpful if you had some help. Worship costs money too. So we do have worship expenses right now. We have to have licensing. To put the songs up on the screen, we have to have a special license to do that. Copyright license. We have the bare minimum. There's probably some things that we do here at this church that go beyond what that copyright license covers. I'm going to be totally honest with you. So that costs more money to get that up. I just got something the other day from that group that talked about. It mentioned if you play music outside of your service, it's not covered. And so, yeah, that just sounds like another thing that people trying to get money from you. But in order to be fully compliant with law, we're supposed to do that. And so there was a budget for that. There's also music, new music is one thing. I purchase that right now. So whenever we start a new song, I'm purchasing it. But there's expenses to that. And then, if you ever want to get away from just listening to music, and you want to have people playing, you're either going to have to pay musicians, or you're going to have to have them here, which is what we want. You don't want to pay good musicians. And you need instruments. So, and then we've had some problems, if you didn't notice, with our audio up here sometimes. It doesn't always work the way it's supposed to, and sometimes that needs it. So something you have to think about. Then there's outreach. So you have to be able to pay. Usually there's something going on. Usually we're feeding people. I mean, we don't do anything in the church without feeding people, without eating. And so that would have to have a budget. So all of that in my plan came up to $50,000. Well, notice earlier I said $58,000. It's because we have an obligation. So we ask our people here that come each and every week to give a tithe. That's why we pass the plate around. That's why we have the box at the back. The church also has to tithe. And we do it a little bit. This includes giving to missions. So that actually counts as a chunk of that. It includes funding our district. So we have a district superintendent. Sometimes at the local church you don't see this, but it's a lot of the resources that I have as a pastor. So I have somebody that calls me, our district superintendent, on a pretty regular basis. He's busy, so it's not all the time. But he calls me, checks in with me, encourages me, supports me. And where you would notice a district superintendent is if you didn't have a pastor. Because they step in and they help fill in that role, and they help bring in a new pastor. So if you were on the church board, even when I first was called to be your pastor, district superintendent was here, was facilitating that process. So you gotta pay the guy. So that's where the district stuff, there's some other stuff the district does as well. Sometimes they're focusing on giving more resources to churches. So if you've heard of the Samaria Project, that's a ministry of our district, where they come to each church and they help them take care of some repairs that maybe they've struggled with. We haven't really had them here, but we did have them in Arc City at the Hispanic church, the Casa del Alfarero. They actually did have some work. A few of us went in and we helped them with their thing as well. And then there's, pensions and benefits. So the pastors all have a pension program that they contribute to, but the churches also contribute to funding that to make sure it works. If you have any sort of pension plan at work, it works the same way. Your employer contributes to it, you contribute a little bit to it as well. That's what this is. Now, I am not involved in that plan because I have a pension in the city. So you don't have to worry about that. But we're supposed to be contributing. And finally, we contribute to our university. So all the churches in the US and Canada all have regions. And our region, it shouldn't be a surprise, is Mid-America Nazarene University. That's the one we support. And so part of our budget goes to that. So 16% is what that total number is that we're supposed to guess. It's above 10% that we always talk about, but it's all important stuff. That's $8,000, 16%. So I rounded on purpose. That's $8,000. That's where we come up with the $58,000. Again, I just used that as a static number, and I rounded it to nice $50,000 to make everything look pretty on paper. In reality, nothing is pretty like that. And I just share that not because it's my plan, well, I guess it was my plan, but if it's just my plan, it's not your plan. And this was very abstract, what I just shared with you. It doesn't cover a lot of stuff. It doesn't really get into how any of this would happen. I have stuff that helps with that. I have the whole class. So I took all these classes in order to become ordained. Let's use them. And this is one that I think we could use as a church. So be prepared for me to ask you some things. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what we want to do. That's yours. You're the church. I'm just your person that stands up here and leads here. But you guys are the church. And so this has to be something that you have to want to do. I don't know what it looks like. No idea what it looks like. But we all know, every one of us here would love to see more people in this room. Right? Is there anybody in here that doesn't want more people here? I didn't think so. And it's not just about the people that are here. What we really are focused on is making sure that people are becoming believers, that they have a relationship with their Lord and Savior Jesus, and that they are able to go to heaven. That is the only reason you're here. And it comes right down to it. That's the only thing we care about, is making sure that people are getting to know Jesus. And so that has to be the core focus in anything we do. And of course this has to also be involved. So we can have all this crazy plans. There's plenty of churches. If you want to just go to a show, there's a church for that. The churches that make you just feel good, there's churches for that. And I don't want to do that. I don't think you guys want that either. And so what I ask you to do today is really simple. Go home and pray. Pray about what you think this church could be. And don't think small. Don't have the faith of just that mustard seed. Think big. Because remember that God can do anything. He did it with 12. He started what we have today with just 12 disciples. So there's a whole lot more than 12 Christians in the world today. So let's close in prayer. We'll start it off with prayer. Father, I thank you for giving us a time to think about what it is that you can do. Nothing is impossible when you're by our side. We just have to have that faith. We have to have that. Start with that faith that's just this little bitty seed. Just nothing. Just trusting you to lead us forward. It's not just about who's attending here. It's about what we can do for the kingdom. That's the only thing we should be focusing on, really, at this point of it, is just how can we make your kingdom grow. Sometimes that isn't about who's here in this building. Sometimes that is a more collective thing. So we're not just praying for our church to grow. We're praying for all the churches in our community to grow. Because they all serve a certain area. They all do little things. Some of them do meals. Some of them do kind of what we're doing with clothing. Some help with the homeless. There's all sorts of different ministries going on in this town. And it doesn't have to just be what happens in this building. Father, help us to see that. Help us to keep our eyes open to whatever it is that you have planned for us. And then help us to actually do it. So coming up with a plan by itself is not sufficient. It's just a piece of paper then. It's just something that's written down. We don't want to be like that. We want to actually do what it is that you want us to do and to reach out into our community and make it stronger for you. I ask this all in the name of Jesus' name. I hope that was at least somewhat motivating. I don't know. I'm not a motivational speaker.